Welcome, welcome. We're very, very proud and pleased to have with us Professor Ryan Griffiths. We've been able to interview Professor Griffiths before, but it was years ago. Let me introduce you to our speaker so that you know why we're interviewing him and what this is about. Professor Ryan Griffiths is an associate professor of political science department. He's the director of the Sovereignty Order Conflict Working Group, and he's a senior research associate for the program for the advancement of research on conflict and collaboration. Right now, he works at Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He has also taught at the University of Sydney in Australia, Johns Hopkins University, Barcelona Institute for International Studies, Yale University's Macmillan Center, and he earned a PhD at Columbia University, and he has also recently taught at the Hertie School Center for International Security. He's also the author of this new book that came out. We ordered this and we'll be looking at the Routledge Handbook of Self-Determination and Secession, first book of its kind. And today we're going to be talking to the professor about this article here. Why are some calling for a national divorce? While some Americans are calling for a national divorce, others are calling for marriage counseling by Brigham Tomko on March 2nd, 2023 in Deseret News. And the professor is quoted here in the article, Ryan Griffiths, Syracuse University. And he has a couple other quotes. We'll be covering those. He also claimed to fame, and this is how we first met, was he wrote an article for the Washington Post about 3 years ago. 60 or so secession movements around the world want independence. Now, that article was mostly talking about Bougainville, which is a province that's breaking away from Papua New Guinea, if I'm not mistaken. We conducted an interview with the professor at that time. And then we also followed up with contacts and did an interview with Bougainville independence people themselves. But I'd like to start with a quote from this first interview, and then we'll go to the professor. And this was the thing I asked 3 years ago, and it will be kind of the underwritten background point of this interview.
You do, yes. And this will, you might post this on your website, or what's the outlet for it?
The outlet is a YouTube playlist called Thought Leaders on Political Divorce. Interviews with professors, activists, reporters. We're doing an interview with reporter Tom Elias. Recently, we did an interview with Professor Buckley from George Mason University. Largely, what we've noticed is that political division is getting increasingly bad in America. That is enough preparation. Professor, did I get anything wrong? The background, the book, how we met, your earlier articles, what they talked about. Is there any details that you'd like to share or correct?
No, I think you have the right person.
Okay.
That is in fact me.
Okay. Well, we like to butter people up and build them up and let them know you're actually talking to experts, because when we do these interviews, they're like, they don't know. And I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about, because you should look this person up before you criticize them. Two big questions. Well, we'll start with the first thing. What was the Deseret News article about? Why were you even contacted to be part of that? What's going on in America right now where people are talking about the word national divorce? In your opinion, you've been here last couple of weeks. In your opinion, unfettered, unedited, what's going on in America? Why did this article happen? Why are we having this conversation now? In your opinion?
Sure. I think that, twice in the last couple of weeks, I've been contacted by a media outlet. I think it's just because there's been a bit of a conversation by some political leaders suggesting that maybe now is the time for some sort of political divorce. When they say that, I think it's not super clear what they mean by political divorce. Usually when we talk about secession in the context of the United States, they talk about it in two different ways, in two very different ways. One is the type of secession where, a region breaks away from a country to become a fully independent country. Think of the attempt by the Confederacy in the U.S. Civil War, or, what the Scottish Nationalist Party has been attempting to do in the United Kingdom. There's that type of secession. And that's really the type of secession that I work on. I should be clear about that. But there's another type of conversation in the United States as well about regions of states looking. So, for instance, in Eastern Oregon, there's a movement called the Greater Idaho Movement, where some people in sections of Eastern Oregon are arguing that they should be able to secede from Oregon, but then join the state of Idaho, claiming that there'll be a greater similarity or congruence in terms of political and perhaps social values. So those are two different types of secession. I think it's been in the air lately. You've had people talking about it, but it's not. Look, I'll give my opinion on that in a minute. But I think that that's one of the reasons that people are interested in it, because you have enough people out there, political leaders, et cetera, using that language.
What about Marjorie Taylor Greene and national divorce? My understanding is, and this is why we're asking, is that she is a sitting member of Congress, and she wrote a tweet on President's Day, a national holiday that many Americans interpret as a holiday to bring us all together as Americans. And she said, let's have a national divorce. Now, she clarified it a little bit more, but not initially in that first tweet. She was brought on Hannity, and she made a couple more tweets going on. But a lot of people got upset. They go, how can a sitting member of Congress call for disunity on President's Day? Is that historical that she did that? Is this something to pay attention to? Do Congress members do this kind of stuff all the time? It's not really a big deal. It's just the media. Or is this a historic turning point and we're actually seeing things done that we haven't seen since the 1860s, like sitting members of Congress talk about secession? Which one, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit in between. I don't think it's at all normal for sitting members of Congress to talk about secession in that way. And as you said, that was, of course, what helped ignite the U.S. Civil War back in 1860. So it's certainly not a normal conversation to have. But I'm not sure that this is a sign of it being normalized, partly because, and that's my opinion here, that's partly because I don't follow the regular tweets or pronouncements by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I'm not exactly sure what she meant by that. She could have meant it in a more general way. I don't know. It's possible that she doesn't even know. Maybe she was just riffing and using that language in a way. That doesn't mean it's responsible language. But others who follow her a bit more closely would be able to judge that better. That said, it is something to be careful of. And, as the article in Deseret pointed out, she was called out on that by both Republicans and Democrats for using that language, saying it's not appropriate because if it is taken in a very literal sense, then, people could say, hey, you're a member of Congress and you're calling for secession. And that's not something we want to be doing.
So it is significant that she did it. My understanding is that we haven't had people who are actually in Congress, while in Congress, talking about maybe we should secede since the 1860s. We also saw Ted Cruz was a senator, and while he was in the Senate, also did that. To my knowledge, you have to go back to the Civil War to find, or before the Civil War, to find people who are actually sitting in Congress and actually sitting in the Senate saying, I'm somewhat serious about secession. Is that inaccurate? Do people in Congress and the Senate routinely talk about this? Has this happened over the last century? Or are we seeing kind of a new trend that we haven't seen in roughly a century and a half?
Yeah, look, it's not normal to use that kind of language, for sure. That said, again, I don't know. I'm not in a great position to interpret her meaning when she said that. It's not clear to me that she has a crystal clear meaning. I don't think she used the word secession. I think she used political divorce. What does that mean exactly? I'm not sure. If, in a follow-up interview, she said, yeah, I mean that, somehow we should have this group of human beings secede from that group of human beings and work that out in some process. Yes, I think that'd be very problematic. it's not clear to me that it's so clear. But again, I think that's partly the way I think she's riffing when she is talking in that manner. That doesn't make it responsible to do, but I think that's partly where it's at. But and again, this is just my opinion. But because it's open to that kind of interpretation, right? That it's not clear exactly what she means, and that there's this open question that maybe she doesn't know what she means. Well, I don't think that makes it come across as it's a new thing, that this is the new normal. Then for that to be the new normal, you would have to have many people using that language and being very clear and defending the terms that they're using when they say it. Otherwise, it's just, these could be outlier type events. In my view, I generally see them as that. I think, and I think we've talked about this before, as somebody who does study secessionist movements elsewhere, they're very serious events, right? Half the time they end in conflict. Even if they don't end in conflict, they're still, incredibly turbulent ruptures. And usually when they do get very far or they gain sufficient traction, there is, you need some sort of regionally concentrated group who sees themselves as distinct as a nation. Often there's a linguistic difference, some sort of distinct cultural difference. I don't see any of that going on here. So what I see in terms of the conversation is just political polarization in the United States, some anger being thrown about, not in a constructive way, in my view, but certainly not something that rises to the level of the type of salient and well-developed secessionist movements that I've seen elsewhere.
Let's cover that. In addition to these complicating factors, Griffiths said, and this is from the article, the Deseret article, I took exact quotes. In addition to these complicating factors, Griffiths says he just doesn't see the kind and quality of social cleavages that tend to produce serious attempts at secession in the U.S. Nearly all of the 70 secessionist movements in the world are based on some stark geographic, linguistic, ethnic, or religious boundaries, Griffiths said. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, so let me show you a couple things, and I'd like to get your opinion. Now, one of the things that grabbed me was, from what I understand, you're saying, hey, I study secession movements around the world. There is division in America. It's a problem. But has it hit the level that it takes to actually equal secession, looking at these other examples around the world? Let me show you some evidence, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. The first one is, you would agree that division is pretty bad in America? Would that be fair?
It depends what you mean by that. I think there's substantial political polarization at the moment, worse than over the post-war period. There have been periods in U.S. history when it's been this bad, but that's different kind of division than when I think of secessionists, the conditions that make secessionists ripe. And just as an illustration of that, I mean, I live in a suburb here outside of Syracuse. It's a politically what we call purple suburb,
Right.
I could walk down the street and I don't know all the political loyalties of my neighbors, but I know some are Republicans, some are Democrats. Those aren't issues for any of us, at least in our interpersonal relations. And we're interspersed, you know what I mean? Like maybe there's a Republican over there, maybe there's an independent over there, and there's a whole range of politics. Those are very different conditions. There's a lot of people who just kind of feel like politically in the middle, and they're not geographically sorted. It's not like the South west of the country has all of the moderates and the North has all of the crazy lefties and the South has all of the crazy right folks or anything like that. It's all interspersed, and that doesn't really create the kind of conditions for disruption in that way. It's political polarization on ideological grounds, which I see as a bit different. But yeah.
Okay, we'll get to that. I just want to cover some of the background because
Sure.
The reason that I zeroed in on the Deseret article was they covered statistics that I didn't see anybody else covered. I've read about 40 to 50 different news articles, news shows, YouTube things. I've been covering this in depth. And what got me was Marjorie Taylor Greene comes out with her tweet saying calling for a national divorce. The very next day, and we are in highly polarized terms, MSNBC and Real Clear Politics, alt left, alt right, exact same talking point within 12 hours. And it was, Americans don't have any division. There's really not a division problem. She's making divisions. She's saying this to cause division. She's making up that we're that divided. She's trying to cause division for her own base because it sells to her base. And we don't really have, a history of division. I saw many articles say that. I have seen one and only one article, and that was the one that you were in, go, well, actually, there's some facts to back up what she's saying. And then they listed multiple surveys, multiple facts. And I found that weird that 30 to 50 articles could not give any credence to her talking point that there's division at all. They kind of acted like we're not that divided. And one and only one article was able to come up with facts. I'd like to show you some of those facts now and get your opinion on how divided does this mean we are. Okay, here we go. So these are some of the facts that this article was able to bring up, and basically nobody else was. So the first one is, here we go. This is a survey they did from the Center for Politics. This came out in 2021. It's about a year old. Sabato Cristobal, University of Virginia, Center for Politics. It's a somewhat reputable school. And they had this survey where they said, I have come to view elected party officials from the opposition party as presenting a clear and present danger to American democracy. Biden voters, 80% believe that. Trump voters, 84% believe that. We can also go to this survey by Brightline Research. It came out in 2021. Another survey that's a year old. It was looking at the support for secession across America. And they found, if I can get to this right here. So in the South, where Marjorie Taylor Greene is, it was 66% of Republicans, according to the survey, were supportive of secession. But if you go to the West Coast, it's 47% of Democrats. Additionally, we found this poll from Pew Research. Pew Research is one of the most respected research organizations on earth. This comes from 2017. Partisan divide in political values grows even larger. It's looking from 1994 to 2017, and showing across the board that almost on every issue, the divide magnified by about an additional 100%. We also had an article from the Washington Examiner with Jeremy Zogby of Zogby Polling. Zogby Polling is called a couple presidential races. And he said straight up, there's nothing in our polling that would contradict what Marjorie Taylor Greene said about polarization. In a July 2020 data, for example, when asked if states seceding from the union is legal or illegal, 39% said illegal, 36% said legal. And the rest were unsure. Among Democrats, 43% is legal. Among Republicans, 46%. We can also go to this article from Time magazine, which was talking about how people will not date other people who don't belong to their political party, and that was something new. There's also this, The Big Sort. This was an article in 2008, also updated in 2022. There's a book by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, where he says Americans are already sorting themselves by political affiliation into different things. One of the things he points to is what we call landslide voting counties. So this is a map of 2016. If we go back to 1992, the gray equals areas where you could be a Republican, you could be a Democrat, and you would have a chance of winning. The red equals areas where don't even run as a Democrat. You're going to go nowhere. They vote for Republicans. Same thing with the blue. If you compare the map in 1992 to 2012, and in 2016, the gray is over half of America, and it's almost completely wiped out by 2016. Can we look at these trends with not dating, calling the other side the enemy, division going back 30 years from Pew Research? I don't even trust those people. I don't want them dating my daughter. People saying that we have been sorting ourselves to levels not seen since the 1800s that go back at least 20 years. Is there division, or are all the newspapers right? We're not really that divided. This is just Marjorie making this up. She's trying to push division. There's no trend. There's nothing to back her up. Which one is accurate? Because the media is saying one thing and she's saying something else.
Well, it sounds like it's somewhere in between. I mean, these are all those questions are really about polarization in the United States, and we know that that's going on. Um, we know, there's, they show voting preferences among people in Congress, and they become, moving further apart, with each cycle. So that's all going on. I think the degree to which it is occurring depends on exactly how those questions are asked and the issues you're looking at, and the different graphs that you've shown they're capturing different elements, right? Whether they're sorting or surveys about who would you socialize with, or who would you let your kids play with. Those are different types of questions, um, and they're not questions about secession, they're just questions about polarization. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert on polarization. I do admit
Sure.
that it is happening for sure, and in a way that I don't think is healthy. But I don't think you think it's healthy either, and most people don't. But so yeah, I don't think it's a black and white answer. There's polarization going on. Does that mean then that we should conclude that the statement that a political divorce is it's now, that time has come? Absolutely not, because polarization can be a very different thing from the conditions that lead to secession, for many of the same reasons that I already stated, which is these are ideological differences. The people are interspersed. I mean, we can show red states and blue states, which gives the impression that the state of Utah is 100% Republican, and the state of California is 100% Democrat. But we know that's not true. We know that doesn't even break out that way at the county level. There's just increased polarization. Yeah, so.
Can polarization, in your study of 60 secession movements, did you notice an increase of polarization that eventually led to secession? I mean, I would figure there'd have to be something. They start at some sort of cohesive body, like the Tutsis and the Hutus, and then eventually somebody says with that radio program by the millionaire, they're the enemy, we don't like them. And then you saw how they started to pull apart, where they weren't actually pulled apart at once. So would it be fair to say there is a pattern of political division in the countries that do reach up to the point of secession?
Not exactly. All right. So I want to get at a point here, and hopefully this doesn't come across as too much of like,
Please.
Of an academic type distinction.
Yeah.
Let me use the example you used a second ago of the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda. Okay. Same can be said of Burundi next door. You have two populations there that have a history of conflict, at least over the last several decades in both countries, genocide in the 90s, etc. Right? Now, in neither of those cases, in the history of the conflict since decolonization in either country, have you had secessionist attempts where the Hutu said, all right, we're going to secede, or the Tutsi, since the minority population, said we're going to secede. What you've had instead is ethnic conflict. All right. And one of the reasons you have that rather than what I'm talking about, secession, is because those populations, it's not like the southeast corner of Rwanda is where the Tutsi live, right? And that over there is the Hutu. They're not sorted in that way, all right? What you have instead are villages and towns and urban areas where the populations are interspersed. All right. When you have conditions like that, it doesn't usually lead to secession, because neither side can say, this is our territorial space, we want to separate it from you. You usually need the populations to be unmixed to begin with. If we use the example of the United States Civil War, well, that happened, that ideological division coincided with a north-south division, and we know the history of that and slavery, etc. So it actually created the right conditions for it. To get that, so let's just take the thought experiment that you're putting on the table. If you wanted to just turn up the polarization in the United States to a point where you would get secessionism, you would have to get substantial unmixing of populations, meaning that everybody who says they're blue starts moving in one direction, and everybody in Republican goes the other direction, and maybe they fight over that kind of stuff. That's very unlikely. All right. Instead, what I think people should worry about is good old-fashioned ethnic conflict, which is that people are starting to fight on ideological grounds, not about secession, but about pure ideology. And look, half of the civil wars out there are not about secession. They're about groups fighting about other issues. So that, I think, is the more relevant thought experiment. Are we getting close to that? I don't think so at all. Like I'm very, I tend to, I think a lot of this gets overblown. That's my opinion. But I do think if a danger increase, it's not a secessionist danger. It's one where you'd get a different type of conflict because you do not have geographically concentrated people. To use my example of my neighbors, right? This is not like, we're all interspersed, right? That's a different kind of conflict, not a better conflict. Those conflicts can be very, very bad and awful, but it's a different type.
I think I understand ethnic conflict versus secession. I would like to ask. Oh, I'm sorry.
And it's not, and it's not to say that secession is not ethnic conflict,
Right.
but it relies on ethnic groups that are already somewhat separated that happen to be in the same country.
Sure.
Yeah.
So my question, I would like to repeat the question. There's a guy called Bill Bishop, well-recognized sociologist. He wrote a book called The Big Sort. They covered it in 2008. They covered it in 2018. They covered it in 2022. They're saying it's still trending. This guy is saying we are segregating ourselves. Liberals are moving from New York to other liberal areas. Conservatives are moving out. I'm sure you've heard the stories of Californians moving to Austin, people in Texas and Florida saying we're tired of these Californians moving to our districts. And then I just showed you the maps of landslide counties. We used to have half of America was not a landslide county. That's almost completely wiped out. That is because people moved, and now we have a majority landslide counties for the first time in American history, according to the people who study it. That only happened from sorting. They're literally sorting themselves and moving out. Now, maybe we haven't hit the level of sorting we need for secession, but wouldn't it be fair to say that we already are sorting? And if the sorting that we're doing continued, we might get to the point where we have separated enough populations that secession then becomes a possibility?
It's possible. I mean, it's sort of anything's possible, right? To the issue of sorting, and this would be a good question to ask somebody who works on electoral districts, that kind of thing, and polarization in them. You do see, if I understand what you mean by landslide counties that are no longer competitive. I think that's what you're getting at. Yeah. And there's the primary reason, as I understand it, and let me just be clear. I want to, the sort of buyer beware, what I know about and what I am just a journeyman in.
Sure.
This is a journeyman issue for me. But the primary determinant of the increased percentage in landslide counties has more to do with gerrymandering in the way that counties are drawn. So those counties lines are not fixed, in stone. They move every cycle or every period. So that's one of the reasons that happens. It's not just people that are moving, but it's the actual territories, the actual administrative lines that are moving. Now, does that get to a point where even if a landslide county, so I'd have to know what the threshold for it is. Let's say a landslide county means that the opposition party only has a third of the vote, right? That's not competitive if they can only get a third of the vote. But that still means a third of the people are voting the other way, right? That's a big difference. You mentioned Bougainville at the start of this. Bougainville had an independence referendum a few years ago. And nearly 99% of the population voted for independence. Nearly 99% of the population voted for independence, right? Is there a county in America where one party gets anything like 99%? Maybe, but we'd have to look really hard to get it. It's not even going to be Alameda County that reaches that kind of level. So in any event, I mean, I take the larger point, the thought experiment that you're putting out there, which is that polarization creates trouble, and it can create trouble in different directions, in different ways, I should say. I don't see it as approaching the kind of danger zone that I would be concerned about, where secession is concerned, where actual political divorce is concerned. I think there are many other reasons it's problematic, like struggling to put forth policy solutions, things like that. But it doesn't reach that level for me, where I begin to think of it as this is a very dangerous setting for secessionism.
Just for clarification, Bill Bishop defines it as elections decided by 20 percentage points or more.
Okay.
So the other guy, there's no way you'd ever get close. And he was saying in 1976, 26% of the population lived in a landslide county. In 2012, it's 56%. And then this year, in 2016, it's gone up to 60%. So in the last 40 years, it's gone from 26 to 60%. And he says, I'm not an expert enough. While there is gerrymandering, this is about people specifically moving. It is directly related to humans moving to find political like-minded communities. That's what Bill Bishop says, not me.
Yeah, I'd have to know more about the study. But even if we look at that, so a landslide for him means 20 percentage points. That means that upwards of 40% of a population could still vote for the opposition. That doesn't make it competitive. But it certainly doesn't make it the kind of conditions that I think rise to that sort of level. I also don't know the study. I mean, I would want to know too with that. People are moving, but people's preferences are also pretty flexible, right? Are all those people moving because of political issues, or do they also just move because they take a job? Let's say you work in tech in Silicon Valley, and then you go take a job in Austin. Your political preferences were pretty moderate at the time, but now you're around neighbors who maybe are a little bit more right. So now you start voting right. Those are complex studies. I don't know Bishop's study, but I'd want to know more about those kinds of things.
So here's an article. And again, I'm not the expert on the subject. That's why we're interviewing people. But according to Bill Bishop, in 2022 on National Public Radio, he said it was Americans who were moving to find areas where politics matched their own. So I'm not an expert on this, but he's saying this is straight up people moving to find people who are ideologically sorted, and that is the reason why we have the gigantic shift in landslide counties. But we could just leave that as a debate. I wanted to ask you a different question.
Sure.
So cleavages. We're not seeing the cleavages that it takes for secession to happen. You have studied 60 secession movements around the world. You are an expert. Have you heard of Barbara Walter and her book, How Civil Wars Start?
Yes. I haven't read the book, but I know Barbara Walter and I know her work. Yeah.
So she is, as I understand it, I could be getting this wrong. Second, let me show everybody. Here's the New York Times, How Civil Wars Start, a warning about the State of the Union, came out this year, Barbara Walters. And basically, I'll summarize, but here's the two quotes. There's also crucially a once dominant group whose members are fearful that their status is slipping away. It isn't the downtrodden masses that start a civil war, Walter says, but rather her fellow scholars call sons of the soil, the privileged position that was so unquestioned and pervasive that they simply assume it's true, and they will take whatever action they need to do that. Let me finish the quote here. Sorry. Barbara F. Walters began writing in How Civil Wars Start in 2018. The few people who heard about it thought that it was about a possible second civil war in America, thought it was an exercise in fear-mongering. She writes in her acknowledgments, perhaps even irresistible. That even gives you a sense of Walters' cautious inclinations. As a political scientist, spent her career studying conflicts in other countries. She approaches her work methodologically, patiently gathering her evidence before laying out her case. Walter, as a political scientist, fondness for data sets and numerical scales. She says the United States is firmly within the danger zone of a 5-point scale measuring factionalism and a 21-point scale measuring the country's political index. She goes on to say that a lot of people think this could never happen in America and it will never happen. She is hired by the CIA to do an analysis to tell the CIA when countries are close to collapse. And she's saying, according to the metrics that she gives the CIA, and they've used for 2 decades, America's closer to that than not. Thoughts, feelings?
Well, one observation is that what Walter's talking about there is the other type of ethnic conflict that I distinguished earlier, right? She's talking about, so the point about groups feeling that there's what you have written right there, status slipping away.
Yeah.
That the term that she would use and political science would use for that is relative deprivation, a group that feels like they're losing status and that embitters them, and then that can lead to conflict. So she's brought that up in the context of current U.S. politics, and others have done that. But one of the things that she's getting at is not about, even though she's an expert on Civil War in general. And as I've said before, you can think of civil wars as kind of like there's two different types, and sometimes they overlap. Sometimes it's just civil war about what kind of country you want to be, and then civil war about, wait a second, this group doesn't want to be part of that group's country. They're very different, right? Sometimes you have the same thing, all right? The Russian Revolution was certainly the type about what kind of country we're going to be, and then you had peripheral groups looking to spin off. So sometimes you get both. But what Barbara Walter is really talking about here is really that first one. She's not really talking about secessionist conflict. She's talking about groups becoming agitated, and that agitation increases, and it boils and boils, and it can hit some point. In terms of the scale she's using, I don't know. I don't know the scale or how to think about the metrics of it. But I do take it seriously, that somebody who's an expert on it looks at this and says, hey, there are danger signs, there's warning signs that people should pay attention to. She'd be the person you should interview her and see what she thinks.
I'm trying. I'm going to send her this and see.
Sure. And see what she thinks about it. And she's one of the foremost experts on civil wars. But I do want to say, though, but she talks about civil wars in that broader sense. And I think in this sense, she's talking more about the other type, right?
Fair. I recall in our interview about Bougainville and its independence that there was some violence in Papua New Guinea or between Bougainville, and that it was because there was violence that there seemed to be an understanding that maybe we should let Bougainville take off. That was my recollection from the first interview. Yes,
not quite. There definitely was in the 90s. There was in the 90s they had a civil war, and it was very bad, very tragic. Roughly 20,000 people were killed, which is about 10% of the population of Bougainville. That ended with the peace agreement in 2001. Now, so I think the thrust of the question is, does violence get you to some sort of green light or a peace solution that may get you what you want? In some ways, it did in the case of Bougainville. There were a lot of other things that went on with that too to make that happen. But you mustn't think that violence, but the track record for secessionists that use violence is actually quite bad.
Right. And I do not advocate violence. I'm not saying that violence is bad. I've worked very hard to cover the law, but I have noticed in our conversation that because there was violence in the past, there seemed to be at least a little bit more willingness on the part of the host country and other countries around to go, hey, we don't want to do that again. So maybe we should let them go. We also saw this with East Timor. We saw this with South Sudan. We saw this with Kosovo. There's violence. Let's split them apart. So is there some historical track record for that?
No. So I want to be clear. There, in each of those cases you just mentioned, there was violence, right? And basically all of the most recent countries to emerge, not that Bougainville has gotten there yet, with the exception of Montenegro, right, which seceded non-violently. Violence was there. But set against that are all these other places where, look at Tigray in northern Ethiopia right now. It's not working out for them, and it's a pretty bloody affair. And there are plenty of these. There's a secessionist group in Yemen right now, in Syria. But in each of the cases that you reference, there were other factors that really helped to get them there. In East Timor, there was the fact that they had a colonial history that made them count for decolonization, right? For Bougainville, there were some other factors, including some dynamite diplomacy on behalf of some of their leadership, which helped get them there. And also a regime collapse in Papua New Guinea toward the end because they misplayed their hand, and that led to some trouble as well. But in any event, I think that in a lot of these cases, they are violent, but that's because a lot of them just are purely violent, and it's just it's a bad state of affairs. That's not something that certainly not something that people should be tweeting about, No,
casually. And I don't encourage it. I just noticed that there does seem to occasionally be, yes, many instances of violence in war, and you don't get a secede, but there does occasionally sometimes pop up what appears to be at a surface level this, oh my God, there's a civil war. Let's stop the civil war. Okay, how do we do that? Well, we need to split these people apart so they stop shooting at each other. And it does seem to calm it down somewhat.
Well, you can get a peace agreement, but here's the thing. The way that this kind of works legally is the home state ultimately has to give its blessing.
Right.
That has not happened with Kosovo, but if you've noticed, Kosovo is not a full member of the UN yet, and because Serbia continues to block them. So a lot comes down to what that home state is prepared to do, and they can withdraw their troops and sit back and not do anything, and that country still does not get recognized. Right? It's hard to do anything without that home state veto being removed.
That's my understanding, is if you really want legal secession, you got to get the host country to basically buy in or tacitly agree. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in legal limbo like Kosovo, where some countries recognize it, some countries don't. That decision to sort of make it a country is like, 2-3 decades old. It's still in legal limbo.
Right. Or Northern Cyprus. Northern Cyprus is a great
Northern Cyprus. Yeah. And because you're in legal limbo and you can't really be defined, you don't really get to go into the family of nations. So you don't get all the benefits and the goodies like loans and Olympic teams and recognition. Right. And so you're kind of in this purgatory stage, which isn't good. The countries that don't fully make it, it doesn't seem like the purgatory stage is good for you.
That's right. No. I look, in my 2021 book, I liken this to a club. Sovereign states are a club, and they guard the gates into the club, right? It's like a fraternity. You want to join that fraternity, you've got to convince all the brothers in it to let you in. And they make the rules, and unless they decide to let you in, you're really just stuck. And being stuck in this day and age is problematic because you don't have access to all the goodies that you just mentioned. And that might be better for some places that the alternative was conflict or oppression or or worse conditions. So for the Northern Cypriots, the early 60s were a very violent time for them. So a lot of them will say, well, we'd rather be in this state, even if we're limping along without the goodies, because back then in the early 60s, by the way, it was incredibly violent for us. But, those are the hard choices. Yeah.
How often is economics and we'll have a better economy the driving force for one of these 60 secession movements that you saw?
You know what? It's hard to. That's not something that I can easily quantify by saying the dominant force. Like I'd have to have these terrific surveys or something. Fair enough. But the economic argument is almost always there. But most of the time, like let's say, for instance, Catalonia, right? You would think that the economic argument should be pretty strong because Catalonia is wealthier on average than most of the rest of Spain. And there's an argument that the leadership makes, that they lose out from fiscal redistribution. They pay more taxes to the central government than they get back in social services. So there is a losing deal. You can imagine a wealthy state. You can imagine California making that argument, right? That, it's a losing proposition. But then you ask people on the streets of Barcelona, which I spent a lot of time with the movement there, and they always said the driver for us is cultural. It's the cultural differences that we feel. Yes, those economic factors matter, but we feel distinct. We feel like we're not recognized as a distinct nation. So at the end of the day, those things are very potent, right? If the Scots, they've worked hard to talk about the difference in economics and how they might be better off separate from the UK, it's not clear that would be true. But at the end of the day, I think what really tips people over is this kind of hard to define, sort of national identity issue that sometimes people really embrace, and sometimes they're not so sure that they're ready to embrace.
I saw that with Scotland. There was an interest in secession. And then after they lost the vote, they were kind of accepting it. And then when England pulled out of the EU, boy, they got mad. They were like, whoa, 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 whoa. You said we were going to be Europeans. And what I got, the impression I got was the Scots felt themselves as Europeans. And they're like, you're taking us away from, we view ourselves as a kind of Europeans, and you're pulling us away from that orbit. And culturally, we don't like that. Yeah, there were issues before, but they say the British lied to them during Brexit about the EU vote. I don't know if that's true or not, but they seem very mad about that.
They were. That's right. So yeah, a majority of Scots voted against Brexit, right? And so that argument was picked up after Brexit by the Scottish leadership. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, very astutely brought that up right away and said, hey, wait a second, this changes the game. Previously, we thought we couldn't ask for another referendum for a generation because you can't ask for it every day, right? What kind of society is going to function like that?
Right.
But this changes it. And so I have to admit, I've been surprised because I thought that was going to energize the Scottish movement. And for a moment, it sort of did. But, it's what, nearly 9 years on. And now they're slipping again. So it wasn't enough, right? A lot of these movements, when you're in that sort of 30 to 50% range, there's a lot of people who just, it's hard to get traction, right? And so it wasn't enough to really put Scotland back in over the edge.
So we could say, looking at Catalonia and Scotland, let's take them at their word for this thought experiment. You're going to make so much more money independent. It seems like that wasn't the only reason why they wanted to be independent. There was a cultural reason. They felt culturally distinct, and they wanted to be culturally tied to things. And then we look at East Timor, Kosovo, South Sudan, Bougainville, Iceland, I think from Denmark. That also seems to be some sort of cultural cleavage. Like Kosovo didn't say, we need to be independent so we can make more money, right? I mean, that never happened. South Sudan didn't say, oh, we can start selling oil. And they were like, we want to stop being shot. You seem to not like us. We seem not, so it seems like maybe the driving force for secession movements is the ethnic difference and not necessarily the economic difference.
Look, I think the ethnic difference is, it's usually referenced as the biggest factor. And I think it's always there. I'm hard pressed to think of a legitimate secessionist effort where there isn't a very clear ethnicity or difference that people can point to. The economic argument is usually made, but in many cases, it's an afterthought, right? In the case of Bougainville, for instance, there was an economic argument made by some that the central copper mines, called the Panguna copper mine, most of the revenue was going to the PNG state and not given to Bougainville, even though they actually had a pretty good deal as far as those deals go. But that was only, a small section of the population that made that argument. I think the larger difference became about ethnicity. But there's an important point too. With none of these movements, right? It's not the case that you have 100% of everybody in that area all on board with it. In the case of Bougainville, you had a small section that began a guerrilla war. And then people gradually got sucked into the conflict. A lot of people were just trying to steer clear of it and may not even have been aware you've got nearly 30 languages in Bougainville, right? This is not the kind of thing where everybody can pick up the paper and say, this is what our leaders are saying. Most of them don't even know what's going on. Wow. And a lot of them are internally fighting. You've got factions within that are fighting one another. So they're incredibly complex and violent events.
And again, for everybody watching this, violence is bad. Do not use violence for political means. We don't support that at all, but we do want to talk about. So let me ask you about the American Revolution. Some people say the American Revolution was a secession movement. These were English people who spoke English, largely read the same literature, largely still sent their kids to English schools. In fact, you didn't really have an American linguistic culture until Merriam-Webster, about somewhere in the 1800s. So culturally, they're very close to the English. In fact, there's some English historians who say the only reason that the Americans felt that they could secede to form a more perfect union was they were Englishmen, and English had some of the most rights compared to any other European country at that time. That was not an ethnic difference, and yet they said, we're seceding and we're out, especially after they started a little bit of violence. How does that fit into the model?
Yeah. So look, I code the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution, as a case of secession. Absolutely. It was, administrative regions, colonies of a sovereign state. They attempted to break away. They declared independence, right? They issued a Declaration of Independence that has then become, this is interesting, a template for most declarations of independence since that time, right? Most declarations these days use kind of like they use the American Declaration as sort of a blueprint. They change the names, obviously. It's not Mad Libs, but they use a similar sort of structure, right?
Yeah.
But to the question of ethnic difference, yeah, look, sometimes the differences are not so, they're not super sharp, right? So the difference between, I don't know, West Papua and Indonesia, those are pretty sharp differences, right? These are radically different groups in all sorts of ways. I think the American colonists vis-a-vis the English back home, or would say the English back home, I guess. Not nearly as sharp as that. But are they any less sharp than the current Scottish movement in the UK? I don't know.
That's good.
And to be honest, I don't know. That'd be hard to assess. You would need some sort of criteria. But certainly the colonists at that time, after generations of being there, and even though we think, well, it's English, it's just across the sea, but across the sea back then, that's like going to Jupiter. You know what I mean? That's a big trip. So there, you had developed cultural differences. I imagine there were accent differences at the time, but I'm only guessing there. I don't know. Yeah.
It would back up your point that you have to have totally separate populations, right? The Americans were very separate from the English at the time of the war. The English had to literally send ships over. It also backs up your point that you have little pockets in Sarge the Latter Party that don't necessarily go with it. A lot of people forget that 1/3 of the colonies, depending on what states you were looking at, were loyalists to the crown. They would be, some of them would be inside of a larger state that was like, we're kicking out the English, and they're like, well, we love the English in Bishop Township. That's so there are possibilities where you can have what might appear to be a similar culture, but for whatever reason, it wants to split. America, England, Scotland, England. It can happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum of difference, right? They're closer on that spectrum than some of these other groups that we're talking about. But Catalonia in Spain, there's a different language. But it's not like having lived there, I can't walk around the streets of Barcelona and pick out Spaniards from Catalans. Right. A lot of Catalan independence people are people who moved as a child from other parts of Spain. So these things get they get fuzzy.
They get muddy. My favorite is there was some comedy show called the 9-9 about these New York cops, and they had an international crime, and they had fellow cops from Sweden and fellow cops from Denmark come, and all they did was trash talk the other when they literally speak the same language and they have the same history. But like, we're not like those Danes. We're not like, and it was, and they literally looked almost identical. They made sure they had almost the same accent. So the Americans are going, what are you guys talking about? And then, for them, they're like, oh, we split 100 years ago. This is important.
Sure. Yeah.
Let me ask you one last thing, if I may. I really appreciate your time. So splitting up states, a lot of people said very difficult to do. One thing, I've made this map here, and the red represents the areas that are dominant Republican, meaning they landslide counties. They vote Republican all the time. And the blue represents the Democrat, and there's a dashed line. And you can see from 2008 to 2018, and this goes up to 2020 and 2022, California used to be conservative, but it seems that we're pushing the conservatives out to the mountains and to the far north. This red area is largely the mountains and the far north, and it's largely where there isn't much population. would it be possible to have a split here, somewhere halfway down the middle? Yes, you would have conservatives in Los Angeles. My stepdad is a conservative. He voted for Trump, but he also knows that all of his friends are liberals and he's not going to change the climate. And if he really hates it, his only option is to get out, and he's not going to do it. Is there the possibility to have a simple split there when we seem to have the political ideology broken up against sides of the state boundaries?
I'm just looking at the map. Oh, I see. There's a white supremacist incident. Is that what that says?
Yeah, sorry. So I was pointing out that it'll be things like the high school decided to do all blackface. Or they decided to say, they made a post saying Mexican people suck. And you're like, whenever these things happen in California, everyone in California freaks out. And I'm like, okay, well, let's locate where these events are. And they are almost always in an area that was recently went blue and was previously red. Almost that transition period that, like Dr. Walters was saying, the people who were in charge and then realized now they're not in charge. That's where we keep to seeing these racist incidents in California. And it's almost always at the boundary line, not exactly between red and blue. And I see a lot of people say, oh, California can't leave because the Central Valley is all conservative. I live in Fresno. No, it's not. And the last couple elections, we won Stockton, San Joaquin, and Fresno. Yes, we didn't win Tulare, Kern, and Kings, but a huge chunk of the interior of the Central Valley, Orange County, San Diego, the Inland Empire, it's liberal. We're starting to bifurcate ourselves to where yes, there's conservatives throughout California. And if you add them up, they're bigger than a red state. Absolutely true. But from my understanding, they're like my stepdad, him surrounded by 30 other liberals. And the only way you can go to some place where pretty much everybody talks red and it's the majority is the mountains and the far north. Would it be possible to have not a secession, but maybe a state split sort?
Right. Just one thing. So those incidents, the fact that they're near that line is really interesting. That's like a study for somebody to do.
Hey, thank you.
That's just an aside, but
thank you.
Yeah. So the state split thing is. I may have said this to you before, but I've said it to others, which is those become issues of domestic law, which and it has to be sorted out between any state in question, and there's always procedures for it. And you don't see a lot of those anymore, although they've happened for sure in U.S. history. I forget the different thresholds and how those work. So it's a matter of that's certainly possible. What you would need are just the sufficient percentages to be on board for that, and then to be able to reach the thresholds according to the state law. Right, that's all. I don't know if California, as you just pointed out, is at that kind of level.
Sure.
And it sounds like you have a better feel for that than I do. But as a matter of domestic law, those things can't happen. It's the same thing that the Greater Idaho movement is trying to pull off.
That's legal, right? What they're asking for, that's not secession. That's
you can do that. And again, this is not my area, right? This is U.S. domestic law.
Sure.
There are mechanisms to do that, to change boundaries between states, but they're hard to do because you don't see it very much, right? You don't see. I know we have a history of this happening.
Yeah, that's what I was showing.
I mean, what you're showing though are the territorial acquisitions and westward expansion by and large. But if you think about West Virginia, there are these cases where it has happened. But you have to look at the old thresholds and see what's entailed. Below the level of the state is where you see it all the time, right? Municipal secession, county secession. That happens all the time, usually for just pure demographic reasons. My hometown in Florida, I was back recently, and the little island right off the coast that's part of the greater city is looking to secede and form its own city. Not for ethnic reasons. It's just that they think they are better off financially if they're not part of Greater Sarasota. So
is that okay? Happen. Is that okay for locales and things? You know what? I didn't say secession. I just said maybe breaking up the boundaries, maybe redesigning I mean, is it such a horrible idea for us to redesign state boundaries as long as people are voting,
Right.
following a democratic process enshrined in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Should we as Americans be so scared of this concept?
Well, if it's just state secession and moving boundaries, I don't think so. I think that I don't know that Americans are super scared. They're scared of it when they hear it in the context of Marjorie Taylor Greene talking, because then it sounds like polarization and anger and stuff like that. But no, if we think about lower administrative regions where this happens all the time for very standard fiscal reasons, and there is great work in economics that talks about this, which is really, devoid of any of this ethnic tension or issues of conflict. It's just a matter of good administrative policy. So whether that happens at the state level, I don't think people should be scared of it, but there are reasons why it doesn't happen. I think the thresholds are high, and states themselves are always such diverse entities that it doesn't work quite as well as at these micro levels where, to use the example of my hometown, the little island off the coast is now incredibly wealthy relative to the rest of the community. So they're thinking they're in a different position in terms of taxation, even though they cross the bridge to go to work. It's a different kind of thing. And those are standard things that happen all the time in the US. For larger states, it's harder because they're very heterogeneous groups, and states are usually reluctant to give up that, the government in Oregon is probably reluctant to give up all that land out in the East.
Right.
But maybe there's a price that they're willing to pay for it. I don't know.
We used to do this. I looked it up, and 29 states were parceled out of other states or territories. I mean, we used to have a chunk of land and go, new state, new state. In fact, we have more states formed that way than in any other way. And yet when I've seen the discussion about national divorce and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're like, how could we even split up states? And they're not talking about secession. They're like, there's no way to split this up. And I'm like, weren't most states formed this way? How did everyone forget we've had the state ascension process for 2 centuries and it's happened 29 times? I literally saw no one bring up those facts. It was just, there's no possible way to break up a state. How would you even do this? This is stupid. She even brought it. I'm like, we did this. We did this more than we did anything else. How did everybody get collective amnesia?
Well, the biggest problem, and I'll leave you here, I think, with this dropping of the mic comment. The biggest problem you're going to face is the flag. You've got 50 stars on there. 50 is a nice round number. You'd have to if you get 51, you've got to redesign that flag in a beautiful way. And now 51 just doesn't roll off the tongue in the same way that 50 is. That may be just the visual imagery is probably hard for people. Although in our grandparents' time, I guess they remember having 48 and 49 stars.
I was just going to say, people go, oh, you talk about secession, you're threatening the World War II veterans. They didn't even have 50 stars on the flag in World War II, nor in the Civil War. So we'll leave it there. Professor Griffiths, what would you like to leave people with? How would you like them to contact you, if at all? Is there any thoughts you'd like to leave in people's minds over the next week for them to think about where this country's going or the research that you're doing?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. First of all, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you about this stuff. If you're interested in my work, I do have a website. It's my professional website. It's ryangriffiths.com. Pretty straightforward. I guess the thing I would leave with, which has probably come clear in my talking about this, is I'm generally pretty lukewarm on the idea of U.S. secession, for the simple reason that, I look around the people that I know across the political spectrum, and I just see a lot of my fellow, country men and women, and just living our lives. And I think these are all issues that usually can be worked out. So I think one of the comments in that article is, rather than how'd they put it? Rather than a divorce, they should just have couples counseling. I think that's a pretty good idea.
How would we do that?
Oh, how would we do that? Well, that's a good question. I'm not going to answer that right there, but I think that just as a general idea, that would be
okay. I will say that. I will also ask, though, I'll let you go, but I will point out.
Thanks for the website.
There was a guy called Joe Biden, And he said in 2020 that he was going to heal the country and bring everybody together. And you should vote for him because there will be a national calming. That's literally what he campaigned on. We're 2 to 3 years later. Never happened. So if the president of America running on a plan of marriage counseling and getting elected for that can't pull it off, who's going to do it? Who's a bigger authority than the president of America? And then the guy made a speech called the Ultra MAGA speech, where he said 74 million Americans were a threat to national security. He scared half the country, including 50% of the Democrats. They go, wow, you just said half the country is the enemy. So who bigger than the president of America running on a campaign with all of America supporting him is going to be our marriage counselor when that failed? I'll leave it there.
Maybe
You have to answer.
Maybe a better counselor, I guess. I don't know. I mean, if we had the solution for that, then we would probably we'd be anchors of some news channel now. But anyway,
when I get the solution, I'll call you and then we'll take that job.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be bringing you more interviews with more thought leaders. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.